up, brothers and sisters? This is your brother G World 7_D. I'm going to this book again, Africa's Hegemony from Europe, Middle Ages, Its Collapse and Modern Resurgence. Now, on page 131. I think it's 131. Yeah, it is. I always say pick up what I'm saying and then I'm going to hammer on home. Okay, right here. Whites made up most of the slaves until the 15th century. Western slavery occurred during the rise of Greece and Rome, which began as colonies of black Africans from the Kemet, Nubian, and Phoenician empires. The Romans enslaved Slavic people of Eastern Europe, who they considered barbarians or savages. The name slave derived from Slavic people enslaved. Romans also enslaved other Caucasians. Okay, the Romans weren't white. All right. Remember, the Egyptians colonized Greece and Rome. These whites were migrating into what was called Europa, named after the black goddess, in antiquity, and breached the perimeter of the Roman Empire, or resisted Rome's hegemony. These nomadic ethnic groups included Germans, who were originally black. I showed you before the castle where the Germans were protecting the castle from the barbarian whites. Brits, Franks, these are Negroes too, etc. Many of the generals and soldiers responsible for their capture and sales on behalf of the empire were black Africans who were recruited into the armed forces from North Africa and northeastern Africa, today's Middle East. By the 8th century, black Moors and Arabs began raiding southern Europe for slaves. Catching white slaves surged between the 16th and 18th centuries. A relatively recent research study at Ohio State University suggests that 1 million or more European Christians were enslaved by Muslims from North Africa between 1530 and 1780. This number is far higher than any previous estimates. It suggests that white slavery was indeed more common than previously believed, acknowledged, or reported. Robert Davis, professor of history at Ohio State University, in a new book developed a unique methodology to calculate the number of white slaves who were enslaved by pirates, refers as corsairs from Africa's Barbary Coast. Davis estimated that between 1 to 1.25 million European Christians were kidnapped and enslaved in North Africa between 16th and 18th centuries. His methodology and findings appear in his new book, Christian Slave Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy, 1500 to 1800. In an interview, Davis points out that white slavery from 1500 to 1650 superseded enslaving of black Africans to the Americas. Wouldn't that mean black people brought here slaves to the Americas, okay? Well, North America, at least. The slave trade to the New World during this time frame was almost exclusively to Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The Dutch, the French, and English brought in most of the African slaves after 1650. By the 18th century, prior to emancipation in the 19th century, most of the African slaves were held in South America, where most of Africans in diaspora now reside. Because black people are already there. During the high Middle Ages, when white slavery surged, the African slave trade did bring 10 to 12 million blacks to the Americas, not North America. Europeans preferred blacks as slaves in the Americas because of their tolerance of tropical climates and that their color made them more identifiable and therefore easy to recapture. Okay, you always had the dark-skinned Negroes here in Florida, jet black. So they stood out among white colonists. In turn, race became a determinant of being a slave in America. Davis finds this determination not true of white slavery, whereby religion and ethnicity, as much as race, determined who captured and enslaved. Respectfully, Barbary Coast pirates raided ships in the Mediterranean and Atlantic to capture men, women, and children. They often raided seaside villages and searched for slaves. The pirates' raids devastated villages and depopulated them to a greater extent than what European slavers would later do in Africa. The attacks particularly devastated European shipping along the Spanish and Italian coasts. France, England, and Spain each lost thousands of ships, though most of the 17th century, the Muslim slavers captured and enslaved at least 400 sailors a year. Barbary pirates far exceeded the modern attacks by Islamic terrorists, like ISIS, upon Europeans. These corsairs raided coastal settlements as far north as Ireland, Netherlands, and Iceland. In the Mediterranean, numerous coastal towns were nearly completely abandoned by the inhabitants until 1800s. The raids were diminished by the later quarter of the 17th century. European powers invested heavily in more powerful navies to deter and pursue those pirates. By the late 18th century, the United States joined its European allies in pursuit of the corsairs. By the 19th century, Algiers, where most of the pirates resided, was subjected to frequent bombardment. It was invaded in 1830 by the French. Tunis, the other homeland of these pirates, held off the French until 1881. Unbiased accounts interpretation prove that slaves were predominantly white for more than 1,400 years and longer than any other race written in Western history. The majority of the slaves held by the Greeks, Romans, and other Aryans were white from antiquity through the Middle Ages. During the 14th century, African slavery began to surpass that of whites. The perpetual labor of Africans was vital to the extraction of wealth from the New World, primarily through agriculture and mining. Slavery was not determined by race during the Middle Ages. Most slaves were kidnapped or prisoners of war. The slavers were mostly men of color, black Moors, racially mixed Arabs, original Arabs, black. They terrorized and mistreated their white victims. Xenophobia, fear of dark strangers, was a reality for many white Europeans in coastal towns. With fear comes deep-seated resentment that can pass through many generations and may be a factor in some of the deep-seated hatred of African migrants that generates alienation, which in turn is an underlying motive for Islamic terrorism in Europe today. Understanding the true history of the world helps encourage us to value tolerance and assimilation over prejudice, determination, and hubris, which becomes a motive for animus and terror. Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. All right, I talked about right there. I mentioned white slavery. That's one of the reasons what happened in North Africa there, and I just read that to you in this gentleman's book, Dr. Rufus Jimerson, which I read the other day. They were pumping in a lot of white slaves in North Africa, which started a mulattoization up in North Africa. Which I said they got a lot of those fixed mulattoes there now. So a lot of those mulattoes start taking the side of their mama because they had so many harems of white women coming in that they was basically penetrating and raping on white women at mass speed from Morocco to Egypt. I'm telling you, this is a lot of stuff that was happening. You had white slaves here in America because I showed you images before where you had the black masters and the white people on the side who looked like cavemen who had clubs. And then they were like retainer sacrifices when the pharaoh or the high king dies, the servants or slaves who were servicing him will be killed and buried along next to the high king or the high ruler. All right. So I mentioned that before in other videos. But what I mentioned right here, if you caught it, he mentioned before how, quote, Egypt colonized Greece and Rome. Remember, the Pelasgians went to Greece and southern Europe. So those Negroes were already there. So it wasn't like when black folks came and mixed in with white people. No, Negroes were already there. All right. Rome had a bunch of black people ruling it, man. This is something they don't tell you, man. They've been lying. Totally been lying. And I have pictures of people from which is called the Holy Roman Empire, Eastern Rome. I have pictures of nothing but Negroes. And I think I do have pictures of Negroes of Western Rome. All right. So what I'm telling you, to be exact, is that Negroes was ruling Europe before white folks got into power. I showed you a picture before of those castles in Europe and how they were protecting the castles. This is the quote in Germany. Remember, because they were trying to say the Germans were white. Actually, Germans were, quote, people of color. They were Negroes protecting the castles from the white barbarian people. It showed the king, the queen, the prince, the princess, and the guardsmen. And they was wearing like togas that you see in Rome. And they had like these little ballet type shoes that you see in the Egyptians and many the Cherokees, Indians were wearing here in America. So there was obviously a connection. These were all Negroes. And they were protecting the castle from white barbaric people. There's images of black people in Europe with blonde hair. Either their hair was dyed or put in a wig, whatever. They had blonde hair. Jet black woman with blonde hair, long hair, and a ponytail. There's images of that. Black folks did rule the damn world. We weren't just situated in so-called Africa. And those many different wars that would happen in Europe caused the decline and fall of those Negroes in Europe. And when the white folks got the chance, they took to seize power. And in ancient America, you had all type of Negroes here in ancient America. That's why when you look into some of them Yuchi Indians, they look like Khoisan Negroes, man. And so-called black folks come in very different shades and very different physical phenotype features. So you have to pick up on that.